Okay, let's do this. No. No. Why does that hurt so much? Oh, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Oh my, why did I do this to myself? Oh, these videos were so easy to watch. Oh, it hasn't gotten this bad before. Why am I getting so anxious?
Let's talk about stress. Hey guys, welcome back to Dose of Joy. I mentioned very early on, I think in my second video, that I wanted to share more of my science knowledge and what I've learned in my science bachelor's degree that ranges, from physiology to psychology to nutrition even. So from time to time, I'm going to be linking common or not so common things that we experience, the science behind it, and letting you know what is actually happening inside of us. We're starting our very first Science Bites episode discussing the science behind stress, what our HPA Axis is, how that can even increase our experience of stress, and most importantly, whether stress is actually our enemy. Okay, let's begin. Firstly, stress is defined as any physical, mental, or emotional stimulus that disrupts the body's internal balance or our normal physiological state. And a stressor is what causes this stress. I'll be including a definitions list in my description box for you to refer to. What's interesting about stress is that it's defined as something neutral and not negative, but we'll be discussing that later in the video. So in response to stresses, our body has self-regulating processes that bring us to a stable set point. A significant stress response being the activation of the HPA axis, which we'll focus on today. But remember that the HPA axis is just one of the many stress response processes, so it's not the one and only, but at least it will give you a bit of insight into the science behind stress. And here's a quick rundown of what the HPA axis is. The HPA axis is our hormonal stress response system, and the HPA stands for hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal. First, in our brain, our hypothalamus responds to stresses or changes in our system by releasing corticotropin-releasing hormone, also known as CRH, as well as others. This travels directly down a tract to another portion of our brain called the anterior pituitary gland, which releases another hormone, ACTH, also known as adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is then released via our circulation to our adrenal glands, which are located on top of our kidneys, and specifically in the adrenal cortex. This then releases different steroid hormones called glucocorticoids, such as cortisol. You probably have heard of cortisol, and its effects via receptors can range from changes in metabolism, for example, why feeling stressed affects our appetite, or even our immune system, which is why being stressed can make it easier for us to get sick. But once a level of cortisol or steroid hormones in our circulation has been reached, our body will work hard to bring that level back down to achieve homeostasis. This is a very common science term and simply means a relative state of balance and internal stability which is actively maintained by our body to resist changes such as an increased level of cortisol. A simple example is, as JT says, what goes around comes around, or Alicia Keys, what goes up must come down. Essentially, if there is a change, our body will regulate itself to meet its ideal environment again, whether to bring things up or to bring things down. And in this case, the process to reduce steroid hormone levels like cortisol is called negative feedback. How this works is that glucocorticoids like cortisol will bind to specific receptors in your hypothalamus, which will start a negative feedback loop. This will decrease your CRH production in the hypothalamus and therefore the ACTH in your anterior pituitary gland, and therefore reduce the production of glucocorticoids by your adrenal cortex, therefore stopping this heightened stress after the stressor is gone. For example, it could be being very stressed before a test and then feeling very calm after it's done. So cortisol is always running through our body. Cortisol itself is not a bad thing, and many studies have said that short increases of these hormones during times of stress are actually beneficial for us and for our normal brain function. Especially back in the day when stresses like rhinos or drop bears meant life or death, activation of the HPA axis was very important to give you that boost of stress and energy to get out of that situation and survive. But what studies have said is that constant and chronic release of these stress hormones can actually result in dysregulated HPA axis activity. And this has been linked to mental and physical illnesses. For example, in terms of its dysregulation, it's actually possible with constant elevated cortisol levels that it can reduce the negative feedback of the HPA axis. So the hypothalamus doesn't get its signal to reduce its level of CIH production, and therefore leads to continually high cortisol levels. To bring a real life example, I've experienced something like this, or at least similar to the idea of a sustained stress response. I've mentioned this in my mental health journey video, which if you haven't seen, I will link somewhere down below. But I basically say that in my second year of my bachelor's degree, I put so much pressure and stress on myself to do well academically, and I experienced a lot of physical symptoms like chest tightness and difficulty sleeping. These symptoms, however, would only last for that exam period and then disappear, but then leading up to the GAMSAT med-entry exam in third year, it was as if I was on a constant stress high, and I was very sensitive to all types of stresses, even if they weren't previously stressful for me. For example, walking in a big crowd, or being in a rush and waiting in traffic, or even when I was brushing my teeth, I still felt these symptoms of anxiety and stress. So what I've said so far makes it really seem that stress is something to be avoided, something negative, and which I used to believe myself, especially when I was feeling these symptoms. However, Kelly McGonigal's TED Talk argues that no, stress is not our enemy, and mentions findings from a study about viewing stress as harmful.
People who experienced a lot of stress in the previous year had a 43% increased risk of dying. But that was only true for the people who also believed that stress is harmful for your health. People who experienced a lot of stress but did not view stress as harmful were no more likely to die. In fact, they had the lowest risk of dying of anyone in the study, including people who had relatively little stress.
Like what I mentioned earlier, stress is neither positive or negative, so it's how we define stress that determines how it affects us. McGonigal mentions another study where some participants were told to view their stress response and symptoms as helpful before doing a test. This is what they found.
Now, in a typical stress response, your heart rate goes up and your blood vessels constrict like this. And this is one of the reasons that chronic stress is sometimes associated with cardiovascular disease. It's not really healthy to be in this state all the time. But in the study, when participants viewed their stress response as helpful, their blood vessels stayed relaxed like this. Their heart was still pounding, but this is a much healthier cardiovascular profile.
Interestingly, cortisol is actually linked with increased contractile sensitivity of these blood vessels. So less contraction that was found in this study could mean that there was less cortisol released in the body, making it very possible that if you were to change your mindset about stress, you can actually change physiological processes like the HPA axis. So McGonigal advises us to do this.
So my goal as a health psychologist has changed. I no longer want to get rid of your stress. I want to make you better at stress. Hopefully, the next time your heart is pounding from stress, you're going to remember this talk, and you're going to think to yourself, this is my body helping me rise to this challenge. And when you view stress in that way, your body believes you, and your stress response becomes healthier.
So before knowing anything about this, I used to feel so uncomfortable every time my physical symptoms would occur, and I would try and wish it to go away or view it really as something harmful. But then I tried this method of redefining stress, and when these symptoms would come up, I'd say, oh, okay, this stimulus is normal. This is my body working hard, A+. And yeah, I'm grateful that my body is functioning. And what surprised me was that it actually started to help. So before my symptoms would last for, 2 minutes or something, my breathlessness would come up and I'd wish it to go away, so it would just stay there. And then after changing my beliefs, I thought it as something helpful, and it just started to go away by itself in, I think, like 10 seconds. So I'd really recommend that if you experience what I've just talked about, to go try it out and see if it helps you. By simply redefining stress as something positive and helpful, it can change our mental habits of, catastrophizing and feeling overwhelmed, as well as our physiological symptoms. I hope you enjoyed this Science Bites episode and found it as fascinating as I did when I was researching it. And so all the studies that I've gotten all my facts from, I've linked down below so you can have a look for yourself. Okay, I think that's it, and I will see you next time. Bye!